In politics, often most of the attention goes to the federal level, and in politics people are talking about who's going to be running for president in 2016 and what is Congress doing. But the truth is, under our federalist system, it's really state government that has control over most of the policies that affect people's day-to-day lives. I mean, this is a college education policy, and funding for education is generally determined at the state level. In the case of CUNY, because we're City University of New York, a good chunk of our funding, especially at the community college level, comes from the city, but it's still the state that does a huge amount of funding and sets a lot of the rules and procedures that we have to follow. And students who are going into education to be teachers, it's state policies both about the funding of the schools and about requirements for teachers, curriculum, things like that. So many aspects of daily life: driving, rules of the road, car registration, who's going to get a driver's license, things having to do with crime and the criminal justice system. Questions of abortion access vary a lot from state to state. When it comes to questions of marriage and family, divorce, adoption, gay marriage, this is something where you see differences on a state-by-state level. There are issues even for the city. A lot of the things that the city wants to do, they actually have to go to the state to get permission or to get the funding. And there was just a quote I wanted to read from Mayor de Blasio talking about his concerns when Sheldon Silver was going to be stepping down as the state assembly leader, because it's such a powerful position, and Sheldon Silver is from New York City. So he is someone who has had New York City concerns in mind. And the mayor says, it's been tough enough to get our fair share, even with a speaker from New York City. So one can imagine someone from outside, it may be even harder. When Sheldon Silver was assembly leader, one of the things he did was he blocked Mayor Bloomberg's attempt to set up congestion pricing for the city, where drivers would have to pay more coming into New York City at certain times. Even though that's something that seems like it's a city matter, it doesn't mean that the city gets to make that decision. It's actually the state lawmakers up in Albany who can tell New York City what they can do about traffic. When it comes to things having to do with the workplace and jobs, a lot of workplace policies are determined at the state level. And minimum wage, this is a big issue. There is a federal minimum wage, but that federal minimum wage is really just a floor. So every state has to meet that federal minimum wage, but they can go higher and have a higher minimum wage. So if the state legislature votes for it, we can make more money, and it doesn't matter what the federal government says. So things having to do with workplace policy are another important area as well.
I think the indictment of Sheldon Silver was such a big news item because he was there for so long, first of all. I mean, he was there for 21 years. He was such a high-profile figure, and he figured so prominently in so many big decisions that the fact that he may, in fact, have been subject to rather severe, forms of influence peddling or bribery it's just sort of rather shocking, and it really kind of underscores the depth of the corruption in Albany. If it reached all the way to that level, I think the question is, what kind of integrity did the government really have, for a long, long time? So, it's a major story. It's going to take a long time to play out, and it will have significant consequences. The Attorney General Preet Bharara, in his indictment, stressed this process of 3 men in a room, which had been the way that Albany politics had been run for quite a while, which is the state Senate majority leader, the Speaker of the House, and the governor. Really, the three of them can decide major policy on their own. And he, in his indictment, said basically that system itself is corrupt, or at least is subject to influence, because it's not the most public forum, because these individuals are able to wield so much power. It kind of opens the door to influence. If this indictment throws that entire system into question, then it really does kind of throw the state government into question as well, I think. Sheldon Silver is also important because he is elected from Lower Manhattan. He's important to BMCC students because he's elected from Lower Manhattan. His district is just to the south and then to the east of where BMCC is. So his representation affects the environment of BMCC very much. He has also been an advocate for CUNY. He's an advocate for community colleges. He seeks funding for the CUNY system in the state government. He's resisted cuts to CUNY. at the state level. If he is in fact compromised, that really does raise questions in terms of what the future is going to be for CUNY. My colleagues are going to speak, I'm sure, about the extent to which the budget is set in Albany for CUNY. So this is very much something that students should be aware of and concerned about. The Moreland Commission, which was appointed in 2013, was designed specifically to look into these kinds of arrangements, outside income and things of that nature. It's appointed in 2013, and then suddenly in 2014 it's shut down by the governor. And Sheldon Silver was one of the people who wanted to see it shut down. They were asking specifically about his sources of outside income. And that commission was trying to investigate and correct a long time pattern of corruption, and then it was brought to a halt. So I think this is also an issue for that reason.
For BMCC students, there's a lot at stake always in what happens in our state government in Albany. One of the specific things is that our situation in the City University of New York is deeply influenced by Albany decisions, especially the budget that gets written every spring in Albany. Approximately half of the funding for CUNY's senior colleges comes from the New York State budget. Approximately a quarter of the budget for CUNY's community colleges comes from the state of New York. It's a bit less for the community colleges because we get a bit more of our funding from New York City, which is a separate and equally important concern for students. But to focus just on the state, there are two particular times that I think students might want to pay attention to New York State politics. One is election time. Every even-numbered year, 2012, 2014, 2016, New York State has elections. In 2014, we elected governor and other statewide officials, as well as the two branches of the New York State legislature, the New York State Senate and the New York State Assembly. Election time begins, of course, long before November, but from the spring through the summer through the fall of every even-numbered year, it's important for us all to keep our attention not only on what happens in, say, a presidential or a congressional election, but also in New York State elections. The other time that I think students might especially want to pay attention to New York State politics is the spring of every year. And when I say the spring, I guess I mean the late winter through the spring, February, March, April. This is when the state budget for the next year is written. This year, I think people expect a lot of the budget discussions to happen during February and March, a bit earlier than in some years when it's carried over into the summer. The question is, will CUNY funding keep up with CUNY needs? We have extraordinarily high enrollment. Many people want to come to college at CUNY schools, community colleges and senior colleges both, but funding has languished. This is why we don't have quite as small class sizes as we need. It's why we sometimes don't have enough computer labs or books in the library or enough room in our science labs. It's why we don't have enough aid for students, enough full-time professors. The budget that Governor Cuomo has proposed is it's certainly not an increase for CUNY, and many CUNY students and other CUNY community members might take an interest in the budget this year because of that. Every spring, student organizations like the Student Government Associations and the NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, along with faculty groups, travel to Albany to lobby state legislators, and students who have a concern about the CUNY budget and the influence of state decisions on CUNY might want to consider joining a trip like that. We sometimes think of lobbying as something that professional lobbyists do, lawyers or policy experts who talk to government officials as their full-time job. But lobbying, which basically means talking to elected officials, is something that anybody can do. Any citizen can do it. Any community member can do it. You can get on a bus to Albany with your fellow students, sit down at a meeting with a state assembly member or state senator and say to them, here's what my CUNY education means to me. Here's why I think CUNY ought to be a priority for New York State. That makes a difference. It makes a difference if they hear from you.
So we have a new Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, who is selected by Democrats to lead the Assembly, and it's considered historic because he is the first African American to lead the Assembly. So in terms of representation of more diverse New York, that's a good thing. And it's also kind of important to us here in New York City because, of course, the Assembly Speaker is an incredibly powerful position in terms of the flow of legislation, being one of the three men in the room. Sheldon Silver was from New York and helped New York City get New York City interests specifically represented in Albany in terms of share of the budget, in terms of policies, and with a new Speaker being from the Bronx, this is going to be a big advantage to New York City, as opposed to if this were someone from a different part of the state who might not pay so much attention to New York City needs and New York City priorities. Not that much is known to most New Yorkers about Carl Hastie. He hasn't been particularly prominent. He hasn't played a very leading role. He actually said when he got up and gave an 8-minute speech after being elected that it was the longest speech he had ever given in his life. But presumably we'll be hearing a lot more of him and getting to know a lot more about his positions. Some of the things he's come forward for already have to do with supporting an increase in the minimum wage, passing the Women's Equality Act. We're going to be seeing what things he actually prioritizes, though, with the coming budget negotiations and with the coming years.
Students who discover that they have an interest in getting involved in politics have a number of things to consider. You might want to consider a career in politics, possibly working for an elected official or becoming an expert in some particular area of policy. But whether or not you do that, if you just want to be involved as a community member, as a citizen, the most important thing to do is to become involved in some kind of organization, to find other people who care about the things you care about and work with them. Make sure you're voting for the same candidates they're voting for, going to the same protests, the same lobby trips. You can find student organizations, you can find organizations in your neighborhood or in your workplace. Find a group of people who care about what you care about and work with them. It's also, by the way, one of the best ways to learn about politics. We like to think that you can learn a lot in our classes here. I mean, students who have an interest in politics often gravitate to classes in subjects like political science, history, sometimes economics, but it's equally important to learn in the real world of politics, and that means getting involved in organizations with other people who care about what you care about.